Welcome back, everyone, to the Deep Dive. Now, today we're going to really get into this story from Newbury Park, California.
Yeah.
Um, it's the case of 24-year-old Zuberi Sharp and his 15-year-old half-brother, Zide Kohuhau.
Yeah. It's a tough one.
It is, it is. It brings up a lot of questions about mental health, family history, and, really what happened that night.
Well, and one thing that strikes me is how fast everything happened. Going from like this bizarre rescue to a homicide investigation,
Right.
all within hours.
Yeah, we're working with articles from the Thousand Oaks Acorn, a news report from ABC7, and a couple other online articles.
Yep.
And they paint a pretty confusing picture.
Definitely.
So let's try to break it down a little.
Yeah, let's put it all together.
So early December 5th, 2024, firefighters had to pull Zuberi out of a storm drain.
Wow.
Not your typical Tuesday morning.
No, not at all. And looking at the information we have, it seems like there were already concerns about Zuberi's mental state even before this.
Yeah.
A relative actually posted on social media in November about him going missing and appearing disoriented.
Wow.
So, it makes you wonder if this storm drain incident was just random or a sign of something more serious going on.
Yeah, for sure. Adds to the mystery a little bit.
Yeah.
Later that same day, deputies responded to a 911 call at a home on Jean Court.
Okay.
They found Zaid with severe head trauma. It looked like maybe it was from an axe.
Oh, gosh. And that's where things get really bad. Zaid was actually pronounced dead on the way to the hospital.
Later that night, Zuberi is found naked and wielding an axe on the Newbury Park High School football field.
Oh, wow.
He was arrested and booked on suspicion of murder.
That detail about the high school is interesting. It's pretty close to the residence on Jean Court. It almost seems like he may have fled there after the attack on Zaid.
Yeah, it's like a horrifying game of connect the dots.
It is.
December 9th, Zuberi appears in court via Zoom, and his attorney raises a point that really throws a wrench in the whole thing.
Right.
He says he's not sure Zuberi's competent to stand trial. Yeah, and the judge orders a mental health evaluation.
That's it's not about determining if he's guilty or innocent. It's more to figure out if Zuberi is mentally capable of even understanding the legal proceedings against him.
So essentially, can he assist in his own defense?
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah.
So let's say, hypothetically, he's found incompetent. What happens then? Does he just walk?
No, it's not a get-out-of-jail-free card.
Okay.
Most likely, he'd be placed in a mental health facility to get treatment until hopefully his competency is restored. Then and only then would he potentially face trial.
Okay.
But if he's found permanently incompetent, the case could be suspended indefinitely.
Wow, so that just adds another layer
It does.
to this already complicated situation.
A whole other layer.
And to make matters worse, the mental health professional actually requested more time for the evaluation. So the competency hearing has been pushed to January 16th.
Oh, wow. So that leaves Zaid's family just waiting
Yeah.
answers and grieving this horrible loss.
Yeah, it's heartbreaking. The articles mentioned that the family held a funeral and a celebration of life ceremony for him on December 21st. And Ring article shared some details about his life. He had cerebral palsy and used a wheelchair. But his family said he never let that slow him down.
Wow.
He loved music, he played the drums, and they said he was the center of their family.
It's just a reminder that behind all of these headlines and court dates, a young life was tragically cut short,
Yeah.
and a family is dealing with unimaginable pain.
It really does make you think about how we deal with these types of situations as a society. It's so complex.
Yeah.
And it brings us to something that I found that was really jarring when I was going through all of this information.
Huh?
Zuberi's father, Calvin Sharp.
Oh, here's where it gets really, really interesting.
Yeah.
And tough.
Really hard to process this.
Yeah.
Calvin Sharp is currently serving a life sentence
Okay.
for a crime that's eerily similar
Oh, wow.
to what Zuberi's been accused of. Back in 2007, Calvin attacked and killed a 6-year-old boy with a meat cleaver.
Oh, my gosh.
And just like Zuberi, he was found naked when he was arrested.
Wow.
Now get this, Calvin's sentencing date was December 5th, 2012.
Okay.
Exactly 12 years to the day before Zaid was killed.
What are the chances?
It's chilling.
It really is. It makes you wonder, you know, could genetics or this violent family environment have played a role in shaping Zuberi? Did seeing what his father did traumatize him and lead to this?
It makes you wonder if there's a lot more to the story than we even know.
Right.
How much can we really separate a child's actions from their parents' past?
Especially in a case like this.
That's a big question.
It's a question with no easy answer. While it might be tempting to draw a direct line between what Calvin did and what Zuberi is accused of, We have to be careful not to oversimplify
Right,
things.
so don't jump to conclusions.
Yeah.
But it definitely adds another layer to the story.
Absolutely. This case highlights how complicated mental health, family history, and individual responsibility can be.
Okay, so we were talking about Zubairi's dad and the fact that he's in prison for a similar crime. It's a lot to think about. But before we get too deep into that, I want to come back to Zubairi's mental state.
Yeah, it's easy to get caught up in the more, shocking details.
Right.
But understanding Zubairi's mental state is really important, especially with these possible competency issues.
And the sources offer some clues as to what might have been going on. I mean, the storm drain thing is weird on its own,
Right.
and then being found naked with an axe.
Yeah, those details and the social media post from the relative talking about his disorientation, it all points to a possible mental health crisis. This wasn't typical behavior.
It definitely backed up his attorney's doubts about him being competent to stand trial, but I'm still not totally clear on what competent means here. Like, what's the criteria for these evaluations?
It's a good question. It's not just about having a mental illness. The evaluation really digs into whether Zubairi understands the charges against him, the consequences, and if he can actually communicate with his attorney and participate in his defense.
So it's more about, can he understand and engage with the legal process? And
Exactly.
if he can't?
That's where treatment comes in.
Okay.
The goal is to try and help the person become competent again. It's not about excusing the crime, but more about making sure the trial is fair and the defendant understands what's happening.
So say he does get treatment and he is found competent to stand trial, could he still be charged with Zaid's death?
Absolutely. Remember, the competency evaluation is just about the person's current mental state, not their state of mind at the time of the crime. Those are two different things.
Okay, got it. Starting to make a little more sense.
Mental health evaluations in these types of cases are complicated. You need to understand both psychology and law.
It makes you wonder about how many mental health resources are available.
Mm-hmm.
There were signs Zubairi was struggling. What if he'd gotten the right help? Could this have been prevented?
It's the question that's always there. We can't know for sure, but it really highlights the need for early intervention and accessible mental health care. We tend to wait until a crisis hits before we offer help, and sometimes, like in this case, it's too late.
It's not even just about access. There's a huge stigma around mental illness.
Yeah.
People might not seek help because they're afraid of judgment.
It's a huge barrier.
Yeah. We need to make talking about mental health more normal and create an environment where getting help is a sign of strength, not weakness.
I agree completely. We need to shift from reacting to preventing. We need to put resources towards mental health and build a culture where people feel supported to reach out for help.
It makes you think, what if there were more programs in the community that focused on that early intervention and support?
There's research showing those types of programs can make a big difference.
Yeah.
If you address mental health issues early on, you can maybe stop them from becoming crises and affecting lives like this.
Okay, so we've got Zubairi probably struggling with mental health. His dad committed a similar crime. And now we're saying we need better resources. It feels like all these pieces are connected, but I'm not sure I'm seeing the whole picture yet.
It's like a puzzle with some pieces still missing. And the family history aspect, with a crime this awful, it can't be ignored.
It brings up the whole nature versus nurture debate.
Right.
Was Zubairi predisposed to violence because of his dad? Or did knowing about his dad's crime push him in that direction?
It's a really tough question. There might be a genetic component to some personality traits, but it's impossible to know how much that affected what Zubairi allegedly did. And obviously, knowing his father was in prison for murder had to have a big impact on him growing up.
So it's basically impossible to completely separate nature and nurture.
Exactly. This is a perfect example of how they work together.
Yeah.
It's not about blaming one or the other, but understanding how they both play a role.
And this shows just how important childhood experiences are. Trauma, especially something this horrific, can have long-lasting consequences.
Absolutely. This case shows we need trauma-informed care, not just for people who are victims of crime, but for those who are affected indirectly too. We need to give people the right support to help them deal with trauma and learn how to cope in healthy ways.
So regardless of what happens with Zubairi's evaluation, this case is a sign we need to break this cycle of violence. But how? How do we even start?
It's hard, but not impossible. We need to start by recognizing that these situations are complex. We can't just punish someone and move on. We have to deal with the root causes of violence: mental health, poverty, lack of opportunity.
Trauma. So we can't just focus on Zubairi. It's about looking at everything surrounding him and finding ways to step in before violence happens.
Exactly. And that needs a multi-pronged approach. better mental health services programs to teach conflict resolution, community initiatives that give young people positive options.
It sounds like a lot.
It is.
But I guess what this case shows us is we can't ignore this stuff.
You're absolutely right. We can't ignore this. The cost is just too high. We owe it to ourselves, to our communities, to victims like Zaid, to do everything we can to stop this from happening again.
Yeah, I totally agree. This case really makes us look at some uncomfortable truths about ourselves and our society. But maybe it's also a chance to grow and do better.
I think you're right. Even in all this sadness, there's hope. We're talking about these things.
Yeah.
Recognizing that we need change. That's the first step toward progress.
And it's not just about mental health. We need to talk about stopping violence. The similarities between Zuberi's alleged crime and his dad's past are just too obvious to ignore.
It's a tough part of the case to process, but it shows the long-term impact that trauma and violence can have. We need to realize that those impacts can affect families and communities for generations.
So how do we stop that cycle? It feels impossible.
It is a huge task, but I think it starts with understanding. We need to approach these situations with empathy, not just judgment. We have to recognize that people who are violent are often victims themselves of violence or trauma. Now, that doesn't excuse their behavior, but it helps us understand where it comes from and how to prevent it.
It's like we're finally seeing that punishment isn't enough. We need rehabilitation, restorative justice, and we need to address the systemic problems that cause violence.
Exactly. We need a shift in how we think. We need to support programs that teach conflict resolution skills, healthy relationships, and give support to individuals and families affected by violence.
It's a big problem that needs a big solution.
It does.
But I think the biggest takeaway is that we can't just sit back and do nothing. This case is a wake-up call. It's a reminder that we have to create a safer, more just world.
And I think even in this tragedy, there's hope. There's always hope.
You know, while we're talking about hope, I keep thinking about Zaid. His life ended way too soon. But the articles paint a really clear picture of who he was.
His story shows how strong the human spirit is.
His family said he was the heart of their home, that he brought joy and laughter everywhere he went. Makes you realize how precious life is, and that we should appreciate every moment.
That's a beautiful thought. And as we wrap up this deep dive, I think that's the message I want everyone to hear. Let's remember Zaid, not for how he died, but how he lived.
Yeah.
Let's honor him by working towards a world where tragedies like this don't happen as often.
I think that's a perfect note to end on. Thanks for joining us on this tough but important journey. And to everyone listening, keep learning, keep asking questions, and keep talking about this.
We'll be back soon to deep dive into another topic that'll get you thinking.
Yeah.
Until then, take care.
We spent this deep dive looking at the case of Zuberi Sharp and the death of his brother Zaid. It's a story that's made us think about so much mental health family history and how violence can impact everything. But after looking at all of this, where do we go from here? What can we do with what we've learned?
That's the big question, isn't it? How do we move from just understanding to taking action? This case, as tragic as it is, does offer some lessons about where we need to focus.
What are those lessons for you?
Well, first, I think it shows us how badly we need better mental health resources. We know from Zuberi's actions even before this happened that he was struggling. The question is, did anyone see those struggles? And if they did, were there resources there to help him?
That's what gets to me. Even if his family knew he needed help, the mental health system is so hard to navigate. It's expensive, there are wait lists, and there's still this stigma about getting help.
Exactly. The system often fails the people who need it most. We have to make mental health care easier to get, more affordable, and part of our regular health care. It shouldn't be a privilege, it should be a right.
Yeah, I agree. It's like we wait until people are at their absolute worst before we help. What if we focused on preventing things from getting that bad?
That's where I think we can make a difference. Imagine if we had more programs in our communities that dealt with mental health issues early on, before they become huge problems. Programs for kids, for families, for anyone who's feeling lost or overwhelmed. We could stop a lot of suffering that way.
I like that. It's like a safety net.
Yeah.
Not just for one person, but for everyone.
Right, and we need to stop seeing mental health as something to be ashamed of. We have to talk about it openly and honestly in schools, at work, in our families.
It seems like we're starting to get it. The mental health is just as important as physical health. But we have so far to go.
We do, but I have hope. This case has gotten people talking. It's raised awareness. And it's made us face some hard truths about our society. And that's the first step to making things better.
It's not just mental health, though, right?
Mm-hmm.
We also have to figure out how to stop cycles of violence. Zuberi's case and what his dad did are way too similar.
It's hard to think about that part of the case. But it shows what trauma and violence can do. They can affect families and communities for generations.
So how do we stop that cycle? It seems impossible.
It's a huge challenge. I think it starts with understanding. We have to look at these situations with empathy, not just judgment. We need to see that people who do violent things are often victims of violence or trauma themselves. Of course, that doesn't excuse what they do, but it helps us understand why it happens and how to stop it.
It's like we're finally realizing that just punishing people isn't enough.
Hmm.
We need to help them change. We need to focus on healing. We need to fix the problems that lead to violence in the first place.
Exactly. We need a total change in how we think about these things. We need to invest in programs that teach people how to resolve conflicts peacefully, how to have healthy relationships, and programs that help people and families who've experienced violence.
It's complex.
It is.
But the most important thing is that we do something. This case is a wake-up call. It reminds us that we have to build a safer and more just world for everyone.
I agree. And even in this tragedy, there's hope. There's always hope.
You know, as we talk about hope, I keep thinking about Zaid. His life was cut way too short. But the article showed us what a bright light he was.
His story really shows how strong the human spirit can be.
His family said he was the heart of their home. He brought joy and laughter everywhere he went. It makes you realize that life is so precious. We have to appreciate every moment.
That's beautifully said. And as we finish this deep dive, I think that's what I want people to take away from this. Let's remember Zaid. Not for how he died, but for how he lived.
Yes.
Let's honor him by creating a world where things like this happen less and less.
That's the perfect way to end this conversation. Thank you for joining us on this difficult but important journey. And to our listeners, keep learning, keep asking questions, and keep this conversation alive.
We'll be back soon with another deep dive into a topic that will make you think. Until then, take care.
That's all for the Deep Dive today. We'll see you next time.